Greetings, traveler.
Hey guys, a lot of you have been asking me questions about the meta, or am I enjoying it, what are the top 3 classes, etc. So figured I'd make a video for you guys to answer all of those questions. So we'll start with a quick recap about what just changed for those of you who don't know what's going on. So in 10.4, the draft changed from cards based on rarity being offered to cards based on quality being offered. So before you'd get 3 commons, 3 rares, etc. Now you're getting 3 bad cards, 3 good cards, 3 premium cards, and so on. So that change I think is great. I think it improves the way how decks are being drafted. I think it increases the skill level there. So before you would get a premium card with 2 bad cards, and no matter how well that premium card fit into your deck, it'd be kind of silly not to pick it up. Whereas now, usually when you have a premium card offered, yes, there will be a strongest card, just purely highest on the tier list, but it'll be a lot more often that you can deviate from that just because all the other cards are somewhat close and one of them may fit your deck better or suits the meta better or whatever. So it's more up to the pilot to understand the meta and understand his deck, and then, make a decision based on that rather than, hey, that's a fireball and 3 trash cards, so let's pick the fireball. Good. So with the first iteration, they compensated for the loss of quality because that was anticipated. Before, you would almost never pick a terrible card. There was always an alternative. If you're going to force people into terrible picks, if you're going to, put all the premium stuff against each other, then logically the quality of the draft would go down, right? Makes sense. So the anticipation was that Blizzard would compensate for this to keep it somewhat around the same power level. Now they went completely beyond that and boosted the quality by a ridiculous amount. I say ridiculous, not necessarily because it was bad, but because it was just pretty funny. I think at one point you had 9% Lich Kings. You had almost 1 out of 10 chance to get a Lich King in your deck. And that's just purely drafted, that's not Stonehill. So they reacted after a couple of days. The community didn't like it. They toned it down, and now it feels like it's a bit more on the opposite end of the spectrum, where it feels like the decks are worse than before the patch hit, at least some classes. Now that can be just purely feeling, but anyway, so that's what happened. So my opinion on that whole matter is that I don't think that... Okay, so I'll start by addressing it like this. A lot of people always want to know, hey, is this a skill meta? Is this a no skill meta? So I don't think you can know that right now. I think most people heavily underestimate just how much was changed. Whenever there is, an immense change to a game, at the start, I feel like the pros and the casuals, they come a bit closer together just because there is always an information, it's not that everyone is equal all of a sudden again, right? But if you are someone who invests a lot of time into the game, you're going to have a big informational advantage over someone who doesn't do that. So whenever there is a huge change like this, that informational advantage shrinks. So at the start, people love to judge something. They've played 2 arena runs and then they say, wow, this sucks. I lost to a guy where I normally wouldn't lose. It's all RNG, blah, 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 blah. You just can't say that this early on. Even now, I've played over 60 hours of arena last week. I don't really know that much, right? Obviously, I know a lot compared to people who didn't play 60 hours, and I'm, going to share that with you guys. But in the grand scheme of things, with this big of a change happening, there's so much more to test. So I really dislike the, fast judgment where people say, this is good, this is bad, etc. I think the changes are great, they feel great, it's fun, but it's way too early to judge whether it'll be more or less skill dependent, right? It feels like there will be more room for you to learn and to outdraft your opponent, but I need more practice to say that for sure. So now that you know my opinion on it, moving on to what I've actually learned. This is the more interesting part for you guys, of course. Whenever I start to deconstruct the meta, I always try to start with a small group of classes. I find it much easier to get a good picture of a meta if you do it through a couple classes rather than to try and play everything. If you spread yourself too thin, you're not going to see the little nuances, the the little nuances that also give you more of the big picture, if you get what I mean. It allows me to really feel the meta. So for this meta, I chose to go with warrior, shaman, and paladin. The first few days I just tried almost everything, and they definitely felt the strongest, and there was most opportunity to be had there. Also played a little bit of priest, but we won't be diving into that, seeing as I'm not sure if it's going to be consistent enough. But warrior, shaman, and paladin. I think in that order they're also the strongest. So warrior number 1, shaman number 2, paladin number 3, which is insane. You know, 2 months ago people would say you're crazy. So before we dive into how exactly we want to be playing them, let's first talk about why they're so strong right now. I think that Blizzard didn't nerf everyone equally. Now, I don't have any proof of this. I'm not good with interpreting stats, but I play a ton, and to me it's fairly clear that you just get better shaman and warrior drafts than other classes. So it feels like they get more premium packs offered. So for the time being, I would say it's kind of silly not to play warrior shaman, because you're just playing with a quality, you know, advantage. So it's rather silly not to take that. On top of that, they both got a pretty good arena-only card, Crackling Doom for the Shaman and Blazing Longsword for the Warrior. Blazing Longsword is ridiculously strong. Like, you pick it over Gorehowl in, you know, it's a snap pick. You pick it over anything. It is incredibly powerful. Crackling Doom is definitely good, but I don't think it's as good as a Lightning Storm for at least the style that we will be talking about today. I'm pretty sure that if you can draft strong control shamans, Crackling Doom is crazy good. But I feel like the mid-range variant is more consistent. So for that purpose, Lightning Storm will be better. Anyways, diving in. So the archetype that I play for all 3 of these classes, we'll refer to it as a greedy mid-range build. I call it greedy mid-range because you need some powerful win conditions initially to break warriors. That's where I had trouble. When I was drafting decks, I found myself losing to warriors. I was like, this is crazy. Now that I took care of that weakness, it's mainly paladins, just because there's a lot of paladins out there, and if paladins get their good opener, then you know you're going to be in trouble kind of regardless. But because of the paladin losses, I also added in a little bit of AoE. So both the greedy win conditions and the AoE were born of analyzing losses versus warriors and paladins. So we'll start by taking a look at a warrior deck, and then I'll go over the other classes, and then we'll talk about some commonalities and how each class has their own way of doing things, right? But that's easier if I have some examples. So we'll start with this deck over here. It's a warrior list that we played to 12. Now I purposely picked a deck without spellstones because I think spellstones are incredibly powerful, and they're definitely a strong win condition, but I wanted to show you guys that it's possible without as well. Right, so the first thing that you might notice is we're going very, very light on the 2s. We have an Armorsmith, a Historian, and a Gastropod. So Historian's not really a 2. Armorsmith can be a 2 when you're playing against aggressive decks, but you wouldn't even keep it against control matches. And the Gastropod is just a decent card that sometimes will just be the best in the pack, and that's why I pick it. So that's true for all 3 classes. I'm not picking 2-drops, and that's got a specific reason. We just got a follower while I'm recording this off stream. Okay, I'm not gonna start over. Let's go. All right, so the advantage of not picking those 2s, well, you have a couple of advantages, right? The first one is that they're offered against premium cards right now. So if you want to have 6 2-drops in order to hit your curve, you're going to skip on some very powerful cards. Like Golakka Crawler is in like up there, right? So like be able to pick that 2, you're going to need to skip some very powerful cards. So that's an obvious disadvantage. The second one is that because we're going to compensate with 3-drops and 4-drops, the disadvantage you would normally get from skipping your 2 gets absorbed by making sure you land a good 3 and making sure you land a good 4. And with good, we mean just decent, not a Stonehill Defender, but you know, a Frost Rider or a Sewer Ooze into, say, in this case, a Violet Teacher. That's not premium, but that's not an understated 3 or 4 either. So without the 2s, you're not falling behind, but you're getting a significant upside. The overall quality of your deck is going to be much higher. This does mean that in a lot of games, you're going to be the defender. I'm fairly comfortable playing from that role, but there's a couple of things that happen when you're going to be the defender a lot of the time. I value swing cards very highly right now. Weapon destruction, such as Acidic Swampus, Toxic Surus, and the Sludge. You can see that this deck has a Toxic Surus and a Corrosive Sludge. They're valued very highly because the top 3 classes, in my opinion, and I think stat-wise as well, are all weapon classes. So that means if you get to kill one of their weapons, that buys you a little time to then stabilize and take over, because the quality of your deck is going to be higher because you skipped on those 2s. Silences. You can see that this deck has 2 silences as well. Very, very good at swinging the board back for you. If you can silence a Blessing of Kings or a Steed, or even the more, less specific targets such as a Basilisk, if you can hit a silence or a Basilisk. These are all things that help you swing the game back in your favor. So if you're going to be behind, then these swing mechanics go up a lot. MC Tech is also extremely strong when you're playing this kind of style. A specific one that I really like, and it's not necessarily a tech card, but it's Guild Recruiter. You see that there's one Guild Recruiter in this deck as well. Is when you don't have 2s, Guild Recruiter goes up a ton, which is logically because you're going to pull a 3 or a 4. So Guild Recruiter pulling, say, a Violet Teacher or a Grimy Gadgeteer, that's incredibly powerful. So we talked about how the curve is different. That means that you're going to want to have, I'm going to say at least 5, but you can definitely go up to 6, 7, sometimes even 8 3-drops, no problem. It depends on the quality. So if I already have 6 playable 3s and I get a Frost Rider offered, I will probably still pick that Frost Rider, just because it's so important to start your comeback on turn 3. And in games where your opponent doesn't pressure you early, it just means that you're going to be able to mount an even deadlier offense, because you're not drawing 2s later in the game. You're going to have a good 3, a good 4, and then those greedy win conditions are going to come out and win it for you. So what would those greedy win conditions be in this deck? We have a Grimy Gadgeteer. Whenever you're in control of the board and that thing sticks, it is a big problem for your opponent. We have a Scalebane, which is a similar threat. It's only more powerful because the buff happens immediately, and the body is also not understated. So Grimy Gadgeteer, Scalebane. We also have Volcanosaur here, which is top end of the curve. I don't really like to pick too many fatties. So usually when I'm drafting a warrior, if I have 1 or 2 spellstones, that's totally fine for my top end. That means I wouldn't even want that many 6s or any other 7s. We didn't get the spellstone here, so we didn't need to compensate for that a bit. So we have the Volcanosaur. Curator was extremely good in this deck. Picked it over Yashiraj. It just hits earlier and it does so much work because you have the Corrupted Seer, you have the Scalebane, you have the Owl. So definitely some targets in there. So that's the gist of it when you're drafting a warrior deck right now. The weapons are incredibly good at both making sure you don't fall too far behind and making sure you're going to outvalue your opponent. So unless you're playing against the control deck, you're almost always going to end up with more cards than the opponent when you're drafting a warrior in this style, which is crazy to think that warrior easily outvalues most classes right now. But a deck drafted in this style, I'm almost always on the defense. Whether I'm playing a paladin, another warrior, a rogue, it's almost always they're trying to kill you. A mage, right? Same deal. Funny enough, mages are trying to kill warriors now, rather than the other way around. It's only when you're playing versus control classes, such as warlock, priest, to a degree sometimes mage, and sometimes warriors. Sometimes other warriors will draft heavier than you. Not very common, but it'll happen. Then you're going to... So to illustrate the difference between those matchups, right? When you're playing against a deck that's trying to kill you versus a deck that's trying to outvalue you, all you need to do is survive versus a deck that's trying to kill you. Because then you'll win, as a side effect, a byproduct of the defending is like, hey, I held off his aggression and he's out of cards and he just loses. When you're playing against the control deck, however, that's where we need these cards to, mount that good offense. The Scalebane, the Corpse Razor is another good example. So another really sticky card, a card that gives you a lot of advantage once you're ahead on the board. And that's just what's going to happen versus control decks. If you have a mid-range curve such as this, you're going to get ahead on the board, but then you need closers. That's a better way of calling them. Finishers, closers. Scalebane's a great closer. Corpse Razor on its own, not necessarily a closer, but very good at, you know, assisting other minions to close. Volcanosaur is a good closer. Even a Frothing can be a closer. So that's usually the dynamic you're looking for. And that's what you should almost always be looking for. How do I beat aggressive decks? How do I beat control decks? And for every meta, that's going to be a little different because every meta has their own specifics. But for this meta, this is up till now my most successful formula. Strong 3s, strong 4s, good closers, and then survival tools. The survival tools can be the swing cards to buy it at extra time. Taunts in general are valued fairly highly. And then I like to have one, maybe two, well, preferably two good AoE effects. So in Warrior, that's usually your Blazing Longsword, your Fool's Bane, but they use your health as a resource. So in Warrior specifically, I do value Armor and Taunt very highly. So something as an Alloy Armor Smith, I will take somewhat highly. You see that we have a regular Armor Smith in this deck. Taunt-wise, we have Curator, potentially Volcanosaur. It's actually a fairly aggressive deck, mainly because it didn't have the Spellstone. So it didn't have the luxury to focus too much on that defense. But there are definitely other warrior decks I've drafted where I've skipped the Gorehowl for Amount of Fire armor. And the deck ended up going 12, and Amount of Fire was extremely useful in helping us survive. So prioritize your curve. That's your main survival tool. Try to get these comeback weapons, Fool's Bane, Longsword. But then when you have those, right, focus on swing cards to help you stabilize. Good armor gain cards. Don't go pick an Iron Hides, right? But an Armor Smith or an Alloy Armor Smith are fine. Good taunt minions help a lot. You know, Bloodhoof Brave. Even a Gem-Studded Golem helps you survive quite a bit. Because it feels to me that the first 5 games of an arena run, that's where you just need to live, right? And that's a bit more difficult with a style like this because it's not dedicated to just surviving, right? It's not like a control deck where most control decks are just dedicated to survive, where you know you're going to win no matter what if you live. In a deck like this, you need to add those snowbally win conditions as well, so it's a bit harder to play defense, but it's a skill that you can learn, and once you're good at it, you're going to be able to do very well in a meta such as this. All right, moving on from the warrior, let's grab a shaman draft. There we go. Okay, so this is actually a really good example because this is a draft that was inspired by I think a 6-win shaman where 2 of my losses were to warriors, where I'm like, damn. You know, like I made the mistake of just focusing on survival. And the funny thing is that the warriors I played against acted as the control because they drafted a somewhat similar deck as mine, where they just had those powerful weapons because why would you not pick those powerful weapons? And then they had Spellstones. So they were fairly good at holding off early curve because they had a Longsword and a Fool's Bane and then they just made 3 5/5s and killed me. I was like, darn, can't do anything about this. Not with the deck I drafted. So the next shaman deck I drafted, I made sure to pick these greedy mid-range win conditions we talked about. So in a warrior, that would be the Spellstones or the Scalebane, etc. In this particular deck, Evolve is one of those cards because it allows you to... because versus those warrior decks, you will get ahead because they just have a lot more quality cards than you, but it takes a little time to get them all out. But then if you can't seal the deal, they'll end up taking over. They'll play a big taunt, you won't get through, you lose all your minions. They play their Spellstone, they gain the board, etc. So Evolve helps you close out those board states. Mana Tide helps you create this big snowball because obviously if you have a Mana Tide they can't touch, then that fuels your aggression and you can just keep going because If you have 2 cards a turn, they won't be able to hold you off. Bloodlust, another really nice closer, right? Nice finisher. Let's see if there's anything in particular on top here. Ancestral Spirit, right, as the Corpse Raiser is also something where once you're ahead on the board, it's, you know, it can be a 2-mana Bone Drake, which it was quite often in this run. Right? So that's what I was looking for when I drafted my next shaman after I had that 6-win run. This ended up going 9, and based off the quality, I think that's fairly decent, right? Nothing too crazy. No Hex in the deck, right? No Fire Rallies or anything. Not a bad deck by any means, but it's the kind of shaman decks you see out there. There's they can definitely do a lot better than this. So 9 wins with this, pretty respectable, I'd say. An interesting thing about this deck is that I drafted the Crackling Doom over Lightning Storm #1, and because of that I learned that I almost always would want a second Lightning Storm over Crackling Doom. So when you're drafting a shaman like this, which obviously what the video is going to be all about, it's always going to be about this particular archetype because that's the one I've been able to test. The beauty of this arena system is that you can reliably draft the same archetype because of the way how the cards are offered. I think it's fairly rare that you're being forced into, no, you have to do control. It can happen, of course, right? If pick, you know, 2 and 3 are Primordial Drakes, then why not do some control, right? But that's just usually not the case. So focusing once again, right? Look at the 2s. We just have a Sentinel, which I had to pick because I had Crackling Doom, which is too much fun not to. And then a Sun Fury. So if you do pick 2s, if you do pick 2s, pick 2s that do something, that are recyclable in the late game, something that allows you to get some use out of them. Looking at the 3s, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-ish things you want to play on 3. So that's more than fine, but not too many, right? Like I said, you usually want to be, I said minimum 5, but I think comfortably you probably want to be 6, 7 3s, right? Jade Claws somewhat counts as a 3-drop because it will overload your 3. So if you have 2 Jade Claws, don't go pushing for 7 3-drops. That won't work. Usually when you have Jade Claws in your opening hand, mulligan 3-drop, right? Because you're going to Jade Claws on 2, you're not going to be able to play your 3 on 3. So keep that in mind. Jade Claws counts as a 3. Yeah, and then the Lightning Storm, the survival mechanics. Let's see if there were any swing cards in this deck. Not really, right? We have, oh no, we have Dragon Slayer and Ooze. Yeah. So yeah, what can I say? I just value them really highly. Dragon Slayer, Ooze, Silence, because I know that in a lot of cases I'm going to be defending, and swing cards are very useful to create a turn where you can swing the board back to you and get back into the game. If you Dragon Slayer a Scalebane, it's, you know, whatever disadvantage you had at that point evaporates. If you get to MC Tech something, if you get to Ooze a Vine Cleaver, you know, those are all turns where suddenly, boop, you know, whatever happened before is now completely gone. And then if you have a deck that has those, you know, that greedy mid-range curve, you will end up taking control of the game, just because you will not be drawing 1s and 2s. As you can see, we also don't really draft 1s. We have a small-time Buccaneer in here that was kind of forced into that. So, small recap for the Shaman. Because you don't have the amount of weapons and good comeback weapons as the Warrior, we do value AoE effects highly. So, if you can get your hands on 2 Storms, get 2 Storms. I like my first 2 Storms before my first Hex, seeing that currently is a pick that happens quite often. You get Hex, Crushing Hand, Storm. I like to pick 2 Storms first because I'm drafting a curve like this. Same as with the Warrior, try to avoid 1s and 2s. Pick a lot of strong 3s, value them very highly. Frost Rider gets picked over almost anything. Swing cards, tech cards, Dragon Slayer, MCT, Ooze, Silence effects, all those. And then some good finishers, some good closers. Mana Tide, Bloodlust, Evolve, Unstable Evolution if you can get your hands on it. Very, very good cards at closing out the game. All right, let's move to Paladin. So Paladin's always a little tricky just because, you know how I think about the class. You definitely need to put in a lot of effort. This is true. to play it perfectly, right? And to draft it perfectly. But for me, Paladin's always a little bit difficult to talk about, because a lot of the time you're just going to have these really high quality cards, and you know, we all know what high quality Paladin cards. I always try to look at a draft where you didn't just have 3 steeds and, you know, whatever else to win the game. So this was a 12-win Paladin draft that was somewhat experimental when I drafted it. I tried to really force this greedy mid-range archetype, and I remember when drafting it, chat was like, "What are you doing, Shady?" Like, I skipped a lot of good stuff, and I really forced this. And it's so funny because Paladin has this identity, right? Where you just, you know, you play all your small dudes and then you get buffs and you snowball. But I now purposely kind of went against that. I went for a Paladin deck that didn't really identify as a Paladin, if that makes sense. Whenever I played versus other Paladins, I knew I was going to be defending because I knew they were going to try to be faster. Because if you have a look at this curve, once again, we have no 1s, we have 1, 2. So out of all 3 decks, this is probably the slowest deck, right? The slowest mid-range deck. But let's have a look at the 3s. Dragon Slayer, once again, you can see we really value those swing mechanics. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like with the Maul. 5 with the Maul, and then maybe Gravedigger, maybe Defender, right? Stonehill is playable as well. Cobalt Apprentice is another unexpected swing card that actually does decent for me right now. So that could obviously just be a small sample size. But because there's a decent amount of Paladins, and because I usually skip my 2, they do get ahead and they do get some tokens on the board. And Cobalt Apprentice has been really useful for me to take care of that problem. So I'll need to do more testing for that. But if you wanna give him another shot, feel free to do so right now. It's been a good card for me. So Mindbreaker is another one that gets valued fairly highly just because it has 5 health. And if you skip your turn 2, a 2/5 is likely going to either kill the 2 or assist in killing the 2 and then survive. So very useful to have that. Then AoE wise, we have 1 Consec. I would have been totally fine with 2 Consecs. Would have been very useful. I think I picked this somewhat highly as well, skipping strong cards for it. Obviously Consecration is a good card, so makes sense it being a premium pack. Then 2 weapons, which is, you know, just as with the warrior, you want to have those comeback mechanics. You do want to be able to be reactive. If your curve isn't as good as your opponent's and you don't have anything reactive, you're completely at the mercy of how he wishes to interact with your board. Such as, you know, he can Death Speaker you, he can Plague Scientist you, he can cast the Blessing of Kings and trade into your minions. So whenever you have a deck such as a curve such as this, value these reactive cards very highly, which is the same reason why we value all those tech cards highly: Silences, Oozes, Dragon Slayers, and such. So then let's have a look at the greedy part, right? The mid-rangey part, the part essentially that is there to make sure that you can beat control decks, that you can beat warriors that are just waiting for the Spellstone. In this deck, that would be Vine Cleaver, extremely powerful card. Very good at closing out games. Stegodon, especially in conjunction with the Vine Cleaver, good at closing out games. Grime Street Enforcer, another one comparable to the Grimy Gadgeteer, I would say, in terms of how it helps you close out the games. Ivory Knight, once again, when you're in control of the board, you can use the Knight, maybe get a Steed, maybe get a Dino Size, close out the game. Unidentified Maul can be a closer. Stonehill can find you a closer. Light in the Darkness can find you a closer. So we can see that there's these couple greedy cards in there to make sure that we can win the control matchup and any other deck that wishes to be slower than you. Because no matter what deck you draft, you can always find someone either faster than you or slower than you. And that's the beauty, I think, in Arena, is you always need to keep that in the back of your mind and have a strategy prepared for that. So I usually dislike drafting decks that can only do one thing, right? So you have decks that, well, if I get hit by an AoE, I'm dead. Or, you know, if my opponent has healing, I'm dead. Or vice versa, if my opponent has too good of a start, I'm dead. So I always value consistency, and I think you can see that when we're drafting this particular strategy in this meta. We value consistency. We want to be able to beat almost everything out there. All right, I think that's it for now, guys. I think I rambled on for long enough, over half an hour to just cover this. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to just drop them in the comments or just swing by the stream and just ask me directly. I don't mind that. All right, if you guys enjoyed the video, please do like and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.